Yo, what is up everyone? Back here with another video. Today we're going to be doing a Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl team building guide for VGC doubles. If you guys don't know, the game has had a lot of hype around it, and obviously there is a double battles format. A lot of people are doing it. Even if you look in the VGC room right now, I'm sure some people are talking about it. We have Series 11 here, but I'm sure if we were to scroll farther back up, you'd see that people are playing the format. But basically, a lot of people are kind of wondering, well, kind of how do you start with building in this format, because it's a little bit different from Dynamax. There is basically less Pokemon to choose from, and since there is no Dynamax, you have less super offensive options. So basically, really bulky teams are kind of determining the meta right now, and there's very little things that can kind of break through in terms of like hardcore offense, right? So you kind of need to take it as a more slower paced game, and that's a little bit different than what we've seen with Dynamax, where you're able to be very aggressive, put out some damage quickly. So I'm going to be going over how teams are kind of constructed in this format and how you can do it yourself too, just so you can get an idea. So I'm going to be going over a couple different archetypes and kind of explaining how they're built and kind of how they function. So we'll start with a very basic archetype, right? So when we're looking at BDSP, what's it called? VGC standard teams. One of the most standard teams is Cresselia plus Garchomp. So you guys might be wondering, well, okay, so why are these good together? How do these teams work? So basically, these teams are kind of the epitome of what I was talking about in the beginning, which was basically very bulky defensive teams that give you a lot of options to deal with your opponent's options, right? So some teams bias a little more towards offense. In this case, these teams typically focus more around setup or being able to pressure your opponent with certain Pokemon that basically are able to put out a lot of damage quickly, but can also punish passive turns, pretty much. So Garchomp is a great example of that. Now, when you're typically looking at Garchomp on these teams, right, you'll typically see it paired with Cresselia. They're a very common pair with each other. The reason why they work really well together is because you have speed control with Cresselia, you have a very bulky Mon, and it has Levitate, so you can spam Earthquake with Garchomp next to it, right? So pretty much you'll see the Garchomps typically run a set of like Earthquake, Rock Slide, Swords, and Protect. I'm going to reorder that because that's bothering me. There you go. And typically the Garchomp will carry a variety of items between Lumberry or Yache Berry, something like that. Now, the reason why these two work so well together is because you're able to complement each Pokemon in different ways, right? So Cresselia has the ability to set up Calm Mind, and it has the ability to set up Trick Room. And pretty much you can click Earthquake next to the Cresselia, dealing with a lot of the checks that Cresselia doesn't like. For example, it doesn't really like Snarl Spam. Garchomp deals with Arcanine pretty well, right? Garchomp doesn't really like dealing with rain. Cresselia is pretty good in the rain because you can Trick Room in front of it. You can do a bunch of different things, right? And so on. It's pretty much just how they complement each other, what they're able to do together. And they're able to exert so much pressure as a pair that you can focus the rest of the team around kind of rounding out the strength of the team. So typically what you'll see is you'll see Togekiss fill as one of the other partners. So basically, when you're thinking about building a team, you're trying to fill multiple roles almost in terms of what your team can do. Let me actually pull up a notepad here. So think about it like this, right? So we're looking at the team right now, and Garchomp, right, offers strong pressure. Basically, it checks certain Pokemon that can slow down Cresselia, right? Slow down Cresselia. It has setup. It's a strong physical attacker, and it pretty much is able to exert pressure that way, right? Then you have Cresselia. It also checks certain things Garchomp can't deal with, and acts as speed control, right? So basically, you already have condensed within these two roles a bunch of things that you would want spread out across an entire team, right? So Cresselia is able to set up as well, which gives it a strong setup option, but it can also just attack as a special attacker, right? And it has speed control with Trick Room, right? Now, you might be like, okay, well, Cresselia doesn't exactly have the best offensive stats, but because it's so bulky, you can actually invest into its special attack pretty heavily, without any drawback. Because let's say even we make it modest, right, and we invest a whole bunch of EVs into it, you'll see that like our bulk is still really good. 140, 150, the HP is already high, so you can invest into the HP and kind of ignore the defenses. But you have so much bulk with Cresselia that you're afforded the opportunity to be able to invest into its special attack, so it's not just like basically doing negligible damage, right? Now, the reason why you'd put Togekiss here, right, would be Togekiss basically helps both, because Togekiss is a fairy type, right? So you're pretty much ignoring any of the weaknesses that Garchomp has, specifically dragon type, so you can redirect dragon moves, and ice is a repetitive weakness, so you can't ignore that, right? And then fairy you can redirect for neutral, right? So pretty much it gives you a way to protect Garchomp and Cresselia. So basically what this allows you to do is that you can have redirection with it, right? It gives you a strong setup breaker because you have crit with Scope Lens and Super Lux, so you're able to break through setup, opposing Cresselia even, you can get a good chunk of damage onto, right? And you're able to basically use these all in combination to have a really strong core. So when it comes to building in doubles, you're not so much focused on each individual Pokemon being good, you're focused on how the team works as a collective. So now we can talk about some of the synergy between this core, right? So synergy between this core, right? Garchomp can Earthquake next to Cresselia and Togekiss. Togekiss and Garchomp have a strong fairy and dragon core. So basically they cover each other's weaknesses pretty much. You would actually have one more mon to fill out the typing core, but I'll get to that in a second. And you have a mix between special and physical attackers. This is good because you don't get walled by a certain kind of like setup, right? So for example, something is iron defense, you're not going to get walled by physical, you're not going to get walled by iron defense, right? And if something has special moves or special defense boosting moves, you're not going to get walled by a special defense boosting move. It's important to have basically a split between your mons. So that's kind of crucial there, right? Now, basically when you're building teams, right, we kind of have a general idea of how this core is working together, but there's a lot more that goes into it, right? So pretty much in Pokemon, there are two popular typing cores, right? And these two popular typing cores are Dragon, Fairy, Steel and Fire, Water, Grass, right? Now, basically, these two cores complement each other the best in terms of defensive switching and coverage. There are also other coverage cores that are really nice. So Dark, Psychic, and Fighting is one of note. But it's kind of that concept basically. So you're able to put on a lot of pressure versus basically opposing teams and force them to have wide variety of coverage on their end, right? To really put pressure on you. So basically to go over it, you're kind of implementing these typing cores along with the roles and everything, and it's kind of coming together into this like one giant like masterpiece of a team, I guess is kind of a cheesy way to say it, but pretty much what you're doing is you're combining all this knowledge and you're putting it all together to make one good construction of a team, right? So if we go and we look at this, I had mentioned that Steel round out the team quite well because Garchomp is weak to dragon moves, it's weak to ice moves, and it's weak to fairy moves. Having a steel type means that you remove the dragon, the fairy, and the ice weakness, and Togekiss also removes the dragon weakness. So you have two pivots into it. Now, this is pretty much where you'll see a kind of that typing come into play. And then pretty much Cresselia is just kind of that round out mon that gives you an extra mode to the team, right? It gives you the option Trick Room, it gives you the option of other setup, pretty much that, right? Now, looking at the team, there's basically two ways that these teams like to flesh out, but I'm just going to go with the more basic route, right? So we pretty much want to make sure that we don't have too much physical attackers or too much special attackers, so we have a really good balance right now. We have 2 physical attackers, 3 setup mons, and 1 redirection, which kind of enables all the setup for these mons. So this is a very like kind of it's weird. So it's like a bulky offense team because you're able to exert a lot of pressure with your offensive options early, but you also punish these passive turns, like I had mentioned earlier. So pretty much this team is aimed around being very flexible and not basically restricting you into one line of play. So for example, something like Rain, which we'll get touch on a little bit later in this video, is a little bit more straightforward, like, okay, I need to attack, I need to get damage, I need to remove things. Whereas this team, more flexible, you can lead different things, you can put yourself in better positions. So yeah, we'll continue from here. Basically now, rounding out the team, you kind of want to make sure you have enough defensive options, right? So typically damage reduction is something that's very nice in VGC, right? And something to prevent status is, or what's it called, status prevention, is usually very nice if your team doesn't already have items to deal with it, right? So now we're thinking, okay, so we want something to reduce damage. We want something that's going to be preventing status. What can fill that role? So a popular intimidator in the format right now is Arcanine. Now, why is Arcanine good? Not only does it get access to Intimidate, but it gets access to Safeguard. And if your team already has answers for status, you can be running something like Will-O-Wisp. And on top of that, you get Flare Blitz, right? You get Will-O-Wisp or Safeguard, and then you get Snarl, right? So basically, you're giving yourself a strong way to reduce the opponent's damage while you are taking advantage of the turns to either set up or to be dealing damage to the opponent. So these teams are very focused around weaving in damage, reducing your opponent's damage, putting yourself in the perfect position to really be getting that damage. So you'll see the team is coming together, and basically the way it's constructed is pretty much focused around having a lot of pivots into the opponent's team, along with a lot of options to deal with anything the opponent can do. So now we have redirection, we have damage reduction, we have setup on 3 mons. We have Trick Room, which allows us to play a little basically defensive if like there's something with Tailwind or something really offensive. And we also have a ton of things that can just exert that damage. Now, to round out the team, basically you can go multiple different routes. So you'll see that we have 3 physical attackers. If you're trying to go for the pure balance of the team, typically you'll see Rotom Wash on these teams a lot. The reason why Rotom Wash is so good is because of its typing. The only thing it's weak to is Grass. Combined with its ability, obviously. You can Earthquake with Chomp next to Rotom. And on top of that, the Grass weakness is mitigated by the Arcanine, the Scizor, and the Togekiss. So basically, you're pretty much able to negate that one weakness that Rotom has, and the team, as a collective, covers each other very well. So if we look at the team, right, now we have a couple of very strong cores. And this is very crucial to when you're building a team, is having strong cores. So you'll see we have the Dragon Fairy Steel core, which is Garchomp, Togekiss, Garchomp plus Togekiss plus Scizor. Typically, you'll see this rounded out with Cresselia or Arcanine, but it always depends. Remember, it can always depend on what you're playing versus, right? We have the core of Cresselia plus Garchomp plus Arcanine plus Rotom. Right, if you're looking for kind of a more defensive core. And it's very flexible from here, right? So basically, the main idea I'm trying to convey is these cores are very centered around giving you as many options as possible to beat your opponents while giving you the flexibility to change up your game plans, right? You're not limited into one thing. You have multiple routes of setup on this team. You have 4 things that can set up on this team, and you have speed control, which allows you to be flexible if your opponent's very fast and offensive. And because of the redirection and the Intimidate, you're able to really prevent the opponent from getting key crucial KOs against you. Now, the way to prevent this from being something that is bad for you, right, is pretty much making sure that those setup options counteract the passive switches from your team. And this is kind of how these teams are constructed. So hopefully that's something that makes sense to you guys. I wanted to kind of go through this team in particular. We're going to be going through a couple of other teams, but this is basically the main way it's constructed and kind of the idea behind it. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And if you guys are always interested in learning more, I do offer coaching below and more stuff. And on my Patreon, I upload teams for you guys to try out and use. But yeah, so this is like kind of a standard Cresselia Garchomp team, if that makes sense to you. So next team I want to touch on is Rain. So Rain is basically very focused around putting on a lot of offensive pressure early. So typically, when you look at Rain teams, you're going to see Kingdra and you're going to see Politoed. Sometimes instead of those, you'll see Pelipper or you'll see Ludicolo, right? So basically, there's a little bit of flexibility there. But one thing that's very different from the team that we had just discussed, which is focused around very passive play, or not passive play, but like, a little more defensive play and kind of getting yourself in the right position, is Kingdra plus Politoed is very centered around weather control, so speed control, right? So centered around speed control and exerting immediate offense. So this doesn't mean that the team won't have a defensive aspect to it, but what it does mean is that the team is going to be focused around putting on that pressure a lot earlier, right? So you're not going to be worried about setting up as much. You're basically going to be going full in, I'm doing damage as soon as the game begins, right? Now, typically, that's why you'll see partners next to Politoed and Kingdra complemented on the physical end of things, so putting on physical pressure in terms of damage. A couple builds have had banned Snorlax next to it. Another thing that I think works really well with Rain in particular is actually Hariyama. So Hariyama is basically something that can run Guts and Flame Orb. Basically, you're trying to get as much offensive coverage as possible, and the combination of water and fighting, along with the Dark move knockoff that Hariyama can run, lets you put on a lot of pressure. And as I mentioned, this team is very focused around doing damage. So obviously, you want to be giving your Kingdra free turns to kind of capitalize on that offense. So what you can do is you can run Fake Out on Hariyama, which gives you more turns to pin the opponent with Fake Out plus Muddy Water, Fake Out plus Draco Meteor, even swapping Hariyama into Politoed and going for a Muddy Water or going for a Hydro Pump, whatever you're going for. So basically the team is kind of hitting your opponent with as much offense as possible to put them in a bad position for later in the game. And to complement that, Hariyama typically runs Feint. Feint is basically a move that can break, protect, or break detect. So if your opponent's trying to play defensive versus you and pivot, you can pretty much punish that by clicking Feint and then clicking whatever move from Kingdra, right? So you're exerting a lot of offense immediately, as I have mentioned. And Politoed on top of that, I don't know if it gets help. It does not get Helping Hand in this format. So typically it's going to be running something like Perish Song. Perish Song perfectly complements this core because you can play for a Perish Song endgame where basically you take 2 KOs quickly. You take 2 KOs quickly, set Perish, then stall the last 3 turns to guarantee the game, right? And then you have some pins with Feint plus attack, or doubling a slot even if you want to, because like fighting plus water or fighting plus dragon covers slots pretty well besides in the fairy types, but then you can water move into it instead. So basically you're going to be getting a lot of damage. So water plus fighting covers a lot of types, so you can always punish a switch, right? Now typically you'll see these teams kind of rounded out. It really depends on the person's preference. Typically you'll see Cresselia on these teams sometimes. You can see a bit of different options. One thing that's also really good is Scizor. So the reason why Scizor is really good on these teams particularly is because obviously its main weakness is fire, right? So how the heck did that happen? What the? You guys see this? Huh. Weird. I have no clue how that happened. Anyways, going into more detail with this, it kind of gives you that core to complement the offense as well, because Steel and Bug are unique coverage that the team doesn't have yet. And on top of that, you're protecting the Scizor with the Rain, right? And as I mentioned, you're balancing out the physical and special attackers with your team, right? Because these are 2 special attackers and you have 2 physical attackers. Now, typically with these teams, there's some unique routes you can go. With these Rain teams, I think what's really nice is double Fake Out sometimes. Smeargle is an option that's typically very underrated in these formats. It needs something offensive to really succeed because it doesn't do damage or put on pressure on the opponent on its own. It's really the combination of Fake Out and Spore plus like attacks that really can pressure the opponent, right? So Smeargle, along with Hariyama, offering double Fake Out pressure gives you a lot of free turns to be doing damage with your Politoed and your Kingdra. And then the Scizor as well can be setting up Swords Dances to punish those passive turns. Now you'll notice with this team, it is very much more centered around dealing damage and playing for the Parasong endgame. So that is something to be mindful of. Now, typically sometimes the way these teams can kind of round out that more offensive nature is by having an intimidator that will kind of slow down the game a little bit, but not kind of slow the momentum too much. Typically, Arcanine usually feels it the best on Rain. You still usually want like some kind of fire type because Rain can kind of get bodied by like really strong grass types. There is a lack of that this format, but it's still nice to have something that can at least generally reduce damage and offer Intimidate to the team, right? So it's something that I think has a lot of merit as a whole. But hopefully this makes sense to you guys. So basically, in comparison to this previous Garchomp team we were discussing, the Garchomp team's very bulk centered, right? It's very centered around punishing passive turns, getting set up, not allowing the opponent to really breathe or like get a free swap in. Whereas this team is focused on immediately punishing those swaps with damage, right? You're basically saying, I can't you can't stop me from dealing damage to you, and I'm going to deal damage to you every single turn. And Scissor gives you that one option to punish a passive turn with like Swords Dance or something. But typically, you're going to see it be more focused around the offensive nature of the Kingdra and the Politoed, and then Scizor or Hariyama or something cleaning up. But yeah, that's pretty much what we would say for Rain. And one more team I wanted to touch on that I think has a lot of merit in this format, and this is also something worth noting, by the way. This format does not have a flat rules. So basically, it won't force up the Smeargle or any other mon that you would want to keep level 1 to level 50. So that does allow you to do some things like, oh, hold on, I picked the wrong format. It basically does allow you to do some cheesy things where you can have a Smeargle, right? And you can run level 1, right? Because this is technically legal by the rules, right? You'll see, right? There's nothing stopping you. You can run level 1 Focus Sash Smeargle, and you can run Endeavor or something on it that will allow you to bring the target's HP down to nothing, and then you can run Feint or some priority move and just instantly like ruin the mon. Like, look at this, 12 HP. Even if you lowered it down to 12 HP and it wasn't 1 HP, you would be absolutely ruining any chance that the opponent had to basically get any kind of damage or get any kind of like health back, right? Because you're lowering it so low that like any move is going to pick it off. It's like super interesting, and it's something that was utilized back in 2009 when we had a similar format. Obviously not with the new updated mechanics, but it is something that's really interesting because Smeargle is one of the mons that can typically utilize this. I mean, obviously the main meme back then was, you know, Rattata with Focus Sash and like Endeavor and then Quick Attack, but I think that one's a little less good. I'd probably go with Smeargle here because Smeargle would allow you to really capitalize off of that, right? But anyways, going into it more, the reason why I bring up Smeargle specifically is because the next team we wanted to touch on was going to be Trick Room. So typically with these Trick Room teams, you'll see Rhyperior and Torkoal kind of being the staple of this team. Basically, the main reasoning why is because Eruption, like Charcoal Eruption in Trick Room, basically puts on so much offensive pressure, combined with Rhyperior being able to go for Rock Slides or Earthquakes or even Ice Fang. I think it gets Ice Fang this gen, which is pretty big. And you can even run Drill Run if you don't want to bother your own Torkoal. I don't know if it gets high horsepower. I don't think it does. It does not. But basically, you can utilize these moves next to Torkoal and pretty much just pin the opponent with constant damage. They don't really have any good pivots. And typically, what you'll see paired with these is either something like Cresselia. And these Cresselias can actually run Moonlight because Moonlight gives you 75% health back if you have Sun Up. Or you can go with something like Dusknoir. Now, you might be like, okay, well, why would I go Dusknoir over Cresselia? Pretty much Dusknoir, the difference is that it's just slower than Cresselia. And what you can do is you can run a bevy of different like support moves that Cresselia typically doesn't run. So for example, Will-O-Wisp to ruin physical attackers. It gets Haze. It gets Curse, which you can use to actually basically remove your Dusknoir faster to get in your Backmon. So basically you're chipping yourself for 50%. You're putting some damage on an extra slot and you're able to swap for free. Besides that, obviously it gets some other coverage moves. You can even do Pain Split Haze, which ruins setup from Cresselia, right? Basically not allowing it to get that free setup it wants. And if you're using Haze next to Rhyperior, that means Intimidate pivots won't slow it down, so you're still able to put on a bunch of pressure. But that's kind of the main general idea with it. You don't get access to Bulldoze and Weakness Policy because it doesn't exist in this format. So that's like the main drawback. Now, You might notice with this team, it is a little bit linear, right? Because you're always going to be going for trick rooms. So you're going to have to make sure you have enough options that are able to pressure the opponent into kind of having to take that guessing game of what you're leading. So sometimes what you'll see with these teams is having a sun mode. So basically the team can go for sleep powders, right? It can go for more offensive moves that basically put your opponent in a position where they have to kind of guess between the trick room lead or the sun lead, right? That's going to be able to sleep everything. And that's basically what these teams thrive on. The reason why I specifically highlight Executor instead of highlighting Venusaur, which we'd typically see, is Venusaur's coverage isn't too great at the moment. Whereas Executor is a little bit better matching up into the meta, in my opinion. Because Venusaur just loses to Cresselia, and Cresselia is pretty much everywhere. And Executor, in contrast, actually can function pretty well. And Venusaur is also weak to stuff like Garchomp Earthquake. Or not weak to it, but like it takes neutral damage. And then also it just like has better resistances across the board, which is kind of interesting to see because I don't think you'd ever usually say that in VGC. Now, the one thing also to keep in mind with these teams is making sure that even though you're committing to a sun and a trick room mode, is that you have flexibility between the teams. So, for example, being able to lead something like Smeargle Executor, going for a sleep powder lead, right? Being able to lead Smeargle Dustmore, going for a Trick Room lead, or being able to lead Torkoal Executor, being able to go for a more offensive Sun lead. Basically, what you'll see is that it's not just like pairs. So basically, it's not just one works with one other. They all work with each other, but the trade-off is that there's no trade-off, basically. That's like the benefit of the team, right? Is like you have multiple leads and combinations that can pressure your opponent. So, for example, your opponent's lead might work into Torkoal and Executor, but it might not work into Executor and Smeargle because you have double sleep spam, right? And it allows you to bail yourself out of bad matchups that would otherwise be really difficult. Typically, you'll see in these teams, if you're rounding it out, you'll usually want some form of Intimidate maybe, or having something that complements the fast mode of the team. I like Salamence. I think Salamence is kind of an underrated option in this format. However, you do need to be careful because obviously Cresselia just kind of snipes it with Ice Beam. So you making sure to utilize your other mons to really pressure it is important. Also, too, making sure that your team has the tools to either outlast or remove Cresselia very quickly is important. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So yeah, that's pretty much all the teams I wanted to go over, at least give you guys an example of. Hopefully this explanation made sense in terms of how these teams function and how they're utilized. Basically, I wanted to give you guys a good idea of kind of how these teams were constructed, how they're used, and basically just the fundamentals to build your own team, right? It's very much centered around having dynamic offensive coverage in terms of being able to put on a lot of pressure on your opponent and being able to punish passive turns, being able to pin slots with a combination of moves that they can't swap into, and allowing yourself enough options to give the team that extra push it needs sometimes to put on that pressure, right? So, for example, I mentioned the Sun lead, right? Sun lead puts on pressure, Smeargle Executor, you could even go Intimidate plus something, or you could go Trick Room, right? This team, you have Rain lead, you can go Smeargle Scizor, allow it to set up, you can go Hariyama Kingdra, put on immediate pressure, Arcanine and Kingdra if you want to go for a bit more of a defensive lead. Options go on, and this team probably the most flexible of the bunch, being able to have a bunch of different defensive leads. So hopefully that helps you guys out. Final thoughts. Make sure whatever team you're using always has an answer for Cresselia. Cresselia is really good in this format, so it's going to be very important to have the options to deal with that. Obviously, other mons are good too, and you want to make sure you have options for that, but Cresselia is really running the format right now, so it is very crucial to remember. But once again, guys, thank you for all the support, as always, on these videos. If you guys are interested in more, make sure to check out my other videos. I'll be posting a lot of BDSP content on this channel now that we've kind of gotten into the new games. And if you guys have any questions, make sure to comment them below, and hopefully I'll be able to answer you guys. All right, thanks, and see you guys in the next video. Peace.